practical legal tips on investing in Vietnamese businesses. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hey everyone, this is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, arbitrator, and I work throughout the states of Florida and Texas.
And I'm Federico Vasoli, Italian lawyer qualified at the Bar of Milan, Italy, currently in Hanoi, Vietnam, managing partner of DMTV Global, dmtvglobal.com, with offices in Vietnam, Singapore, and Malta.
Yes, all right, Federico, that deep voice, awesome. So good to have you back, man. So we're going to move on now and talk more about the business of law and the law of business and all the things that you have been doing over the last many years, specifically in Malta, Vietnam, Singapore. And just so people know, if you are new to the podcast, we have been interviewing with Federico for going on 2 years now. And so he's been a regular, just giving tips and legal, not advice, because we can't give legal advice on the show, but legal information, to the public on everything and anything dealing with business law in a quick 20 minutes. And so we encourage you guys to, if you're interested in business law, especially in Southeast Asia, to give dmtvglobal.com a look. That's his website. And also to go back to all of the different videos he's done on these topics on YouTube. Of course, they're on lmipodcast.com as well. And he's schooled me. I've certainly learned a lot that I've never knew before on business, because I've mainly a family law background, guy for the last 14 years. However, family law intersects with business law as well, especially not so much when it comes to international issues, but because this is a international podcast, we definitely have to hit on the business side of international law. All right, Federico, why don't you give a quick reintroduction of yourself, and then let's get into the topic of practical legal tips when you want to invest in Vietnamese business.
Well, Mac, first of all, thank you so much for having me again. It is truly a pleasure to be back on the Lawyers and Mediators International podcast. LMI has been a fantastic source of information. So, as you said, I do encourage our viewers and our listeners to view, to watch, to listen to the previous episodes of our podcasts, and also those given by other speakers. I've learned a lot from them. So I watched not just my own recordings, but also those of other people to learn from them. And it's been truly informative. Indeed, we talked a lot about this part of the world, Southeast Asia, where I ended up already many years ago. So for those that don't remember, and as a brush up, I qualified in Italy in 2007 as a lawyer, but I was already working extensively in this part of the world. My very first job was in Beijing, in China, in 2002. So that is already 21 years ago. I was a young law student from Italy. At the time, why did I end up in China? China was very, very different at the time. Why did I end up there? Because my university was offering internships in various law firms around the world. And the typical destinations for law students at the time in Italy were London or New York. Now, New York was just after 9/11, so it was not that appealing at the time. And as much as I'm fond of the US, of course, and of New York, where I have really good friends and I would love to go back. I've never been to Texas and Florida, by the way.
Yeah.
So I need to. Yeah, exactly. Not yet. I need to catch up. And London, I knew quite well because I had studied in England for a while during high school. So I didn't see any added value, going to those massive law firms where a 22-year-old student would just probably do photocopies. So it looks good on your CV, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't go to one of those massive firms when you're very young, but it was an incredible experience for me to be in China. There were not so many foreign lawyers, especially continental European lawyers at the time, that had this type of specialization. I then worked in other firms in other countries, in Belgium, in Spain, etc. But at the time, there was not, as I said, there was a huge demand for business lawyers that would advise companies on how to do business in China from a legal perspective.
Yeah.
And I rode the wave. Then China changed. We all know that. We follow that in the news. And in 2007, we discovered Vietnam. By we, I mean my former law firm in Milan, that is a family business. Eventually, in 2016, so a huge jump forward through the years. In 2016, I moved to Malta, which is the smallest country within the European Union, former British colony. It's an island nation south of Sicily, so in the heart of the Mediterranean Sea. English speaking, which is fantastic. It has some institutions that are in common with those of common law. So those of you that are more familiar with common law jurisdictions such as Singapore, Hong Kong, of course the US, of course the UK, etc., will find yourselves at ease over there. And eventually I decided to set up my headquarters in Singapore, which is the quintessence of efficiency in this part of the world, also in terms of asset protection for our clients. So that's a pretty broad summary of how I ended up here and what I do. What I do is actually business law. So it's not just business law. We do business law, tax law, asset protection, meaning also secondary passports and residencies. And especially my business partner, who is incidentally the special economic envoy of Antigua and Barbuda to Singapore. He's a specialist in crypto law. So we don't do advisory when it comes to investments in cryptos and stuff like that. We do legal stuff. So you want to apply for an exchange license, you want to issue your tokens, etc. You need to follow the law, and we tell you how to.
Got it. So it always, helps to give us that kind of background once in a while, because there's so much there, and you never know who might be listening to this or watching this, and they might be in Malta or they might be in New York, but they need to go through some business that's located in Texas to do business in Vietnam. Who knows? The world's kind of small, right? It's getting smaller because of the internet. All right. So,
and by the way, I did follow a client from Florida in Vietnam. So they were actually supposed to invest in a Vietnamese business. Eventually, after conducting authority diligence, we advised them not to do so. But we do have we notched a case from Florida, out of Florida.
Yes, small world. So so one of the things is we want to help keep people out of hot water, so people are not getting in trouble with the authorities. Anytime you're talking about stocks and buying shares of businesses or corporations or non-listed entities, you always run some risks, especially if you don't know what the law of that land is. Okay, and there's no one lawyer who's going to know all these laws in any one type of jurisdiction. But again, this is why you should come back to this podcast, so that you can always get little tips and tricks by Federico, especially on Vietnam. And so, Federico, suppose I'm an individual or I have a business here in the US and I want to invest in a Vietnamese company, or I want to invest in stocks in Vietnam. What are, you only got 20 minutes or even less time now, but what are some big points that you would want to discuss that we should be aware of, and some tips regarding them?
Well, it's very broad, but first of all, I'm not going to mention the legal aspects that you should consider from your home jurisdiction. So I'm not going to say anything about Texas or Florida or federal US laws when it comes to investments abroad. There may be some restrictions. For instance, there are indeed restrictions, more and more restrictions imposed by the US federal government on investments in China, as we all know, due to what is happening geopolitically. So do check that out in your home country. I'm going to talk about what happens on the other end of the investment, which is Vietnam. Also, do take a look at the macroeconomic indicators of Vietnam. Vietnam grew. Why would you invest in Vietnam, first of all? I mean, Vietnam, if there was no China in this world, we will talk about the Vietnamese miracle. Vietnam is a country that was in desperate poverty until the 1980s, early 1990s. And then, thanks to reforms that are quite similar to those implemented by China, it followed Chinese steps, it grew immensely, really immensely. I recently met with a new Italian ambassador here in Hanoi. He had been here as a tourist a few years ago, and he could not recognize the city because it's really changed. So there have been fast-paced development, but even though Vietnam recorded a stunning plus 8.02% GDP growth last year in 2022, 2023 is not showing similarly good results so far due to a number of factors. So the number one point is check what your home jurisdiction says. Number two is check how the economy is performing in Vietnam. Then to be more technical, to go more into the details. First of all, financial investments, financial instruments in Vietnam have a number of legal limitations. There are not as many financial instruments as you can find in more developed financial jurisdictions such as the US. You mentioned New York, Wall Street, London, etc. So this is not really a place for core financial investments. It is a place where you can invest in stocks and bonds, and you should do that by using a brokerage firm. So you should open a bank account through a brokerage firm in Vietnam. And by the way, the Vietnam dong, which is the official currency of Vietnam, is not convertible. So similar to what happens in China with the yuan, you cannot exchange US dollars, for instance, into Vietnamese dong outside of Vietnam or outside authorized money exchangers. There may be some at airports when you have direct flights. So if there is a direct flight, say from California to Vietnam, there probably is one from LA to Saigon.
That's new to me. That's new to me. I thought every currency would be exchangeable in the open market. No?
Nope. So there are some outlets that are specifically authorized. For instance, I'm sure that there is one in Hong Kong, one in Singapore airport, etc. But so the stock exchange is denominated in Vietnamese dong, and that means that you need to have an account in Vietnamese dong. So you must go through a brokerage firm that does the exchange for you and offers instruments for you to be able to invest in the stock market. The regulations have changed in 2020 during the pandemic. 2020 was a year of massive reforms, legal reforms here in Vietnam. It was a year of growth. So on the positive side of things, Vietnam did grow also during the pandemic. It was actually the winner of the pandemic, also because it managed it really well in the beginning, and it vaccinated most of its population really quickly using Western vaccines. The US and Europe helped a lot in providing Vietnam with vaccine doses. So
I remember we did some talk during the pandemic about, well, post-pandemic about the changes that were happening because of COVID.
Exactly. So it opened much earlier than China. They didn't have the crazy zero COVID policy that China implemented and essentially blocked the economy for so long. The other possibility is that you invest in an existing business that is not listed on the stock exchange. So it may be, let's call it a financial investment in the sense that you put a chip in an existing Vietnamese company because you believe in the company, you expect it to grow. Maybe you know the shareholders, you know the managers, you know the business, you're a specialist in that business and you expect it to grow. Now, in that case, the two norms to consider, the two key pillars, the key legal pillars to consider are the law on investments and the law on enterprises, which are the foundations of company law here in Vietnam. They were also reformed in 2020. I think we did an episode on the reform of these laws.
Yes, this comes back to memory. Again, I don't think I've ever learned so much about Vietnamese law since I've been talking to you the last couple of years. But yeah, the law of investment and law of
enterprises.
Yes, correct.
The law on enterprises, law on investments apply primarily to foreign investors. It means that you need to register as a foreign investor. Yep. Law on enterprises applies, broadly speaking, to everyone in that whether you are a foreign investor or whether you're a local investor, by investor, I mean business people, really, you follow pretty much the same rules. Now, what are the main differences between local and foreign investors? Essentially, costs, because local investors can set up companies at much lower cost due to simpler procedures, incorporation procedures, and also because they're not expected to inject as much share capital as foreign investors. This is a tricky point in that in Vietnam, there is no such thing as minimum share capital. So like in other jurisdictions, for instance, in Singapore, where you can open a company with $1 share capital, in theory, you could do the same here. However, because your investment is going to be vetted according to the law on investments, you need to show that you have sufficient capital to run it, essentially. It makes sense. And it also makes sense for them to keep some stocks of foreign capitals in local banks.
So does
The second-
Federico, let me
Mhm.
ask you, well, then do you think that prohibits a whole lot of people who would want to invest from not being able to invest because they're not able to show that they can fund?
No, because we're not talking about huge amounts of money for companies. So for
Got it.
individuals, it may be a hefty amount, but we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. So
Okay.
I've never seen a foreign invested company, whether with or without local shareholders, with a share capital below the equivalent of 30,000, 40,000 US dollars.
Got it.
But if you're a business, $30,000, $40,000 is not that much. Also because
Correct.
these $30,000, $40,000 you're going to use in your operations. You're not just going to keep them there in a bank account. So it's
Yeah.
operational capital. It's working capital. So, of course, for larger businesses and for certain types of industries, you have a minimum share capital that is fixed by the law, or that is, in any case, recommended. For instance, if you invest in real estate, you will need to have hundreds of thousands of dollars share capital equivalent in share capital, because if you're expected to, if you're going to buy and sell buildings, flats that are worth millions, of course, you need to have that kind of money to start your operations. The other thing to consider is that there are some industries that are restricted to foreigners. The legal term is conditioned, so they're subject to certain conditions. What are these conditions? One I already mentioned is capitalization. Number two is that maybe the foreign investor cannot exceed a certain amount of shares. So you cannot have 100% of the shares. You must have a local shareholder. Maybe you cannot even have the majority of shares in that business. Depends on the industry.
Yeah,
Then
but this is not unusual, right?
that is
These restrictions are not unusual. Other countries have them as well.
yeah. Generally speaking, yes. There is a catalog of 100 and something. I mentioned that in the previous episode, so I think I mentioned the exact number of industries that are conditioned. Then there are some industries that are forbidden to foreigners. For instance, media is one industry that is forbidden. And the fourth category is everything else. So it's the residual category, meaning like I'm just figuring out probably 80%, 85% of industries, which is completely free, meaning you can come to Vietnam, set up your company, or invest in an existing one. Now, when you invest in an existing company, which is the second scenario, so scenario number one is invest in the stock exchange through a broker. Number two is invest in a local company here. The tricks are that even though the law permits to have a disproportion between the share capital and voting rights, so you may have 10% of shares, but you could have, 40% voting rights. And even though the law permits you to convert goods, knowledge, know-how, trademarks, intellectual property rights into capital, so you give your trademark, you give your know-how in exchange for that, or your machinery. In exchange for that, you get share capital. De facto, the appraisal system is very complicated and expensive. So I recommend that you invest money, cash, in a locally existing company if you want to buy shares out of it. So these are the main recommendations.
Okay, and what about safety? I mean, people start hearing investing cash. How concerned should they be that nobody can guarantee a return, of course, but that their money's gonna be safe?
Well, there are laws and there are bilateral treaties, depending on where you come from. Vietnam has signed the largest number of free trade agreements that also encompass these aspects in multiple cases with a huge number of countries and areas, including the European Union for those of us that are from there, the UK as well. So that puts a safety net. It is indeed possible for foreign shareholders, after paying taxes, after paying whatever they need to pay, employees, suppliers, etc., to get their dividends back to their home country. The safety net that I would use is, the practical tips that I would give is to have multi-currency bank accounts here, so not just in Vietnam dong, to have properly drafted, legally valid agreements. We talked about them in the
Correct. Yes,
episode.
lots of episodes on that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is fundamental. To have properly drafted jurisdiction clauses. Now, having a foreign arbitration award implemented and enforced in Vietnam is not that easy, but it's even more difficult to have a foreign judgment, a foreign sentence recognized and enforced in Vietnam. So my advice is, if you're going to litigate, go to a local arbitration center in Vietnam that is that should give you some guarantees. And when I mentioned cash, I meant it precisely to avoid providing know-how, trade secrets, machinery, and other things that it is more difficult to recover the moment you have a disagreement with the shareholders. If it's cash, it's just cash. You've lost money. But you have not lost maybe your entire know-how, intellectual property rights, and these other matters.
Got it. All right, man. So it's 20 minutes are up. And Federico, to wrap us up, the best way people to get in contact with you is your website, dmtvglobal.com, right?
Or you can reach me on LinkedIn or other major social networks.
Yes. Awesome. Okay, guys, we'll continue this conversation and keep going on with the law of business, the business of law with Federico Vasoli in 20 minutes. And we'll be back. Take care.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you all. Bye-bye.